about that battle against General George Custer and the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. But my great grandfather at that time grew up with just as all Lakota boys did, with a full knowledge of, just being Lakota, being out there on the plains, and just understanding all those life lessons, and understanding plants, understanding how to build tools and weapons, and lodging and clothing, and all the foods, and how to harvest, when to harvest, all the songs that are sung to these foods, and the respect that's given to them, the prayers, the ceremonies. And so, but so like my great grandfather's generation wasn't that long ago. And so I also realized, like, I was born in 1974. Well, I'd already known that, but I was born in 1974, and 100 years before my birth in 1874, all my Lakota family still retain that knowledge, because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota until 1876, and that's when things go down fast for Lakota. We were still battling the U.S. government up until 1890. And so why within less than a single century did we lose so much knowledge? Did we lose so much information? So that's really where this work came from. That became more important to just be able to use this platform as a chef to talk about some of these issues, to explain why it's so important to understand indigenous foods. And that's not a trend, this is something that's important to give back to our indigenous peoples, but also to allow non-indigenous peoples to understand the true value of what the knowledge that indigenous peoples still hold today, and what can be reclaimed as we move forward. So when we're talking about indigenous foods, our focus really is on North America. So I like to look at Mexico through all the way up here, and all the amazing indigenous diversity that's out there. And I just think it's really important to have these stories, because no matter where we are in North America, all of our history begins with indigenous history.
Yes.
So there's just a lot to think about. There's just a lot to think about, like, why are we eating the way we eat? Why are we making ourselves sick? And why are we so disconnected to nature? And why do we continuously exploit nature and extract from nature without thinking about repairing it?
Yeah.
And there's just so much to think about. So as I sat and pondered all these things with floating books and weird jello cakes, it's just a funny picture. I started really doing these talks about pre-colonial foods, but I realized that people didn't even understand what that term meant, especially in the very beginning. Like, people didn't know what does pre-colonial foods mean? What do pre-reservation foods mean? What does it mean to decolonize? So I always like to start from the very beginning, which is just understanding what does that term mean. So to understand that term, you have to understand what colonization is, and this is an important one. So the easiest way to understand colonialism is to Google it. So if you Google the word colonialism, you get a definition: the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying the settlers, and exploiting it economically. So this is something that is not unique to North America, because this has happened all across the globe. It's happened North America, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it. Like, colonization has been going on for quite a while. A lot of it was coming out of European countries. And we just have to look at, what we went through as indigenous peoples on a global scale. So focusing here, all of this colonialism starts with the doctrine of discovery, of basically Europeans creating a situation to say, like, if you discover something, then you own it, right? And we still, like, so many of the laws around the world are really based on that situation of the doctrine of discovery. And it's really insane, because it just, I can't just go to a Best Buy or a Tesla lot and be like, look what I discovered, but that's the way this all formed, So, but we really, the reality is that we don't learn a lot about our own history, because the United States has given us our own history. And we know as indigenous peoples that we've just been through centuries of racism and white supremacy. And it's a really tough thing to break free from. A lot of people don't talk about the indigenous peoples that were also part of the slave trade, because, and when the slave trade was coming through, as 12.5 million people were being stolen from Africa, indigenous peoples from Africa, there's also 5.5 million indigenous peoples on this side of the continent, or this side of the world, that were part of that slave movement. So we have to remember how little history we have in the United States when it comes down to it. So if you look at the United States in the year 1800, we're barely just the 13 colonies that they started with. And the reason that the United States is formed is because they were sick of the British control, obviously, but the British were keeping them from exploiting more indigenous land spaces. They were keeping them from going out and messing with the native tribes and keeping them they were upset because they wanted to explore more land. They wanted to take over more land because they discovered right away that if they are able to take land away from indigenous peoples, then they can commodify it, they can parcel it, they can sell it. And the United States makes an immense amount of money doing that, at the same time utilizing a lot of forced labor from indigenous peoples from Africa. It's a mess, because European countries are making broad claims to huge swaths of land all over the place, because we have the French taking over big chunks, the British taking over huge chunks, the Russians taking over big chunks, the Spanish taking over big chunks, and it just goes on and on. But in reality, in the early 1800s, most of this land space is still stewarded by indigenous peoples. A lot of communities haven't even seen European people at this point in history. And the United States doesn't even really form until the mid 1800s, when they finally strip away Mexico and take over Texas and California and the states in the Southwest. But Mexico used to crawl way up there into Colorado and west, and taking over half of what is California. And the United States government, so I have a slide out of place. All right, one second. But you just have to think about how little time that took during the 1800s, because at the beginning of that century, like I said, over 80% of this land space is owned or not owned, but it's occupied and stewarded by indigenous peoples. And within that single century, at the end of that century, only 2% of this land space is occupied by indigenous peoples, largely just because of the reservation systems. We have states like California, and Minnesota that had bounty systems. California wipes out over 90% of its population within a 15-year period in the 1850s and 1860s. They had bounties of up to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person, which is why we have so many bounty hunter stories. And people could make an immense amount of money. So California paid out millions of dollars. And if you do the math of what inflation, like how much is $200 back in 1850, like it's a lot of money, So people made a lot of cash. Not only did California pay that out, but the United States government pays it out too. So this is just a really intense century for indigenous peoples. We see so many different really aggressive acts by the US government that take over all this land space. We hear about the Texas Rangers. They were formed for the sole purpose of chasing down people escaping slavery and wiping out indigenous communities across the whole southwestern part and messing with people even into Mexico. But we see things like the Homestead Act of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887, the Morrill Act of 1862. Like all of these things are stripping indigenous peoples from rights and taking more land spaces and justifying taking these land spaces to grow and grow and grow. During this time period as indigenous peoples, we see a lot of loss. And one of those losses is, of course, our food access, because colonialism is in full effect throughout the 1800s. We see entire areas getting mowed down. Just so much extreme environmental destruction, because you guys, I'm sure, have seen some old growth forests up here or there, and they're rare, right? Because we've lost almost all of the redwoods because of this. Can you imagine what it would be like just to see so much massive old growth forest in so many different parts of the nation? But the United States is extremely aggressive, and one of the things that they do is just taking out indigenous people. So our very first president, George Washington, one of the first things he does as president is send his General Sullivan out to take out the tribes in the Northeast. And he calls for the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and he wants everybody enslaved, and that's what he orders General Sullivan to go out and do. So over a single summer, General Sullivan in 1779, between May and September, does just that and accomplishes just that. And there's so much documentation that happens along that time period of taking out these really well-built cities with so much just beautiful agriculture going on, because the people were extremely advanced there, and they're wiping out 6 mile by 6 mile crops of farm fields. We have no idea how many seeds of varietals are lost during this time period, and this also just sets the tone, of what happens between U.S. presidents and indigenous peoples for the next century. So, even, today in Haudenosaunee language, the name for U.S. president literally translates to town destroyer, still today. This tone keeps on moving, so we see things in the West. This is a flyer right before the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, where they take out, they take out a huge tribe, and it's really intense, In Minnesota, we have the same situation when the Dakota people tried to stand up and fight for their ways, which is part of my family. They were put onto this reservation, or this concentration camp right outside where Minneapolis is, and then they also kicked out the Ho-Chunk Nation, and they pushed them all into boats, forced them down the Mississippi and then up the Missouri River, and shipped them off to a new reservation called Crow Creek, where some of my grandparents come from. And half the people die on that one single boat ride after this really intense situation. And again, the bounty system is in full effect in Minnesota. And they even passed the Dakota and Ho-Chunk Expulsion Acts in 1863, making it illegal. And those laws actually haven't really been reversed. So it's actually still illegal to be Dakota or Ho-Chunk in the state of Minnesota still today. We also see the extreme destruction of things like the American bison. So we all know that the bison disappeared, but people don't know the whole story because the U.S. government actually, intentionally did that, because they do a study in the late 1850s, early 1860s to see how much bison were out there on the plains, and they had a lot of talks in Congress to decide what to do with the indigenous communities in the West. And they thought it was going to be too expensive to do all-out genocide, and they argued over that. So then they decided that they would take out the food systems, which was largely bison for a lot of tribes from Texas all the way upwards throughout the whole Great Plains, basically. And then so they start paying hunters to go out and just take them out, and they would pay them by the ton, basically. So just massive amounts of bison are slaughtered almost to pure extinction during a very short time period in the mid-1800s. And we see a lot of these things like this Colonel Richard Dodge, kill every buffalo you can, every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. And that was the sentiment coming out of Washington at that time period. And there's all these little snippets of this one that says that, there are 2,000 hunters on the plains killing these animals, and this is 1874, and one party of only 16 hunters reported killing 28,000 of them. So this animal is just being completely wiped off the map, and it's an environmental catastrophe by removing something that's from these land spaces, And people just don't understand, because as Lakota, we use bison a lot, and there's stories of when the bison disappeared, and the community's trying to understand what was happening, because everything was changing, so quickly. And one of the things I feel that has been the hardest for us as indigenous peoples after all of this extreme violence that happens against us was really the loss of our own education. So if you take a moment to define what is indigenous education, it was the thousands of generations of ancestral knowledge being handed down to us to give us the tools to do everything. Because indigenous peoples around the globe had the blueprint to live sustainably with the world around them, and as they had for generations upon generations. So this comes to a screeching halt during the end of these 1800s, because we go through this really intense era of assimilation. So my grandparents' era, at the turn of the century, they should have been downloading those thousands of generations of ancestral knowledge, but instead this education is completely stripped from us. We're forced to go into boarding schools. And when I visited Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the first Indian boarding school, it's a really intense situation, because these kids are literally pulled from their communities and forced to go to the school. They're forced to cut their hair. They're forced to learn a different religion, learn a different language. They're punished for even speaking their own languages. They said that the kids would be forced to brush their teeth with pumice stones if they were caught speaking their languages, because this was a military school. This was not a fun place for kids to go. And these boarding schools happen to pop up all over the United States. And this is a really intense era for us, because we're being stripped of our own knowledge bases, and we're being assimilated. And instead of learning all this valuable knowledge that our ancestors have, it's being replaced with something else. And this happens, all across, everywhere in the US, all over Canada, and which they call residential schools. And we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to this, because the United States has barely started to even peel back the intensity of what happens in these boarding school situations. My mom went to boarding school and she will not talk about it. There was a ceremony that happened in 2019, and I think this is in Ottawa, but they wrote down the names of all the children they could find that passed away in the residential schools just in Canada alone. And then shortly after that, they started searching the grounds of those residential schools and finding hundreds of bodies just around one school. So now they're in the thousands of all these unmarked graves that they're finding all over the place. And the United States hasn't even touched this yet, you know? But I think it's really important and powerful to watch this banner, because remember, this banner is just every name, and this is probably only maybe 10% of the names that should be on, if not more. And, you know, this is really super intense, you know, and it should be, because, you know, like the Pope was just up in Canada apologizing for the genocide of things that happened because of the Catholic Church. But we don't need the Pope's apology. We need the United States and Canadian governments to take responsibility for the damage that they did and the extreme violence that they caused and created and still hold on to, you know. So, you know, that's the 1800s, and then we're in the 1900s. And the 1900s weren't much better, because the 1900s just become a full century of racial segregation and, you know, just further assimilation. We're not even citizens until 1924. And then, and then as soon as we became citizens, they realized they didn't know how to classify us as indigenous peoples. So then they create the Racial Integrity Act that exact same year in 1924, so they could segregate us, you know, because they only had segregation against Black Americans, but then they also had to figure out how to segregate Native peoples too. We have a really intense couple of decades of Indian termination and relocation policies that spread us all over the place. And, you know, one that's not talked about hardly at all is the Indian adoption era between 1941 and 1967. And this should be more of a topic that people talk about, because during this time period, which that's a long time period, 1/3 of all Native children are pulled from their homes and put into white families. And that's just another form of cultural genocide, stripping us from our own communities. And a lot of people lose so much of their culture during this time period.
It's still happening here.
And it's still happening, exactly. So we're not past all of this. Just, you know, this is some of the points of this situation. We can't vote until 1965. A lot of places we couldn't vote until, like in South Dakota, we couldn't vote until the 80s, because the South Dakota government wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties, which meant the Native counties, which was a lot of them. And then they just gerrymander everything, you know, so the Native votes to take a soft blow, if even anymore, you know. We couldn't even celebrate our own religions openly until 1978. So you just have to remember, like, the intensity of how we went through this. So, you know, what is it like in post-colonial Native America? Like, we actually haven't exited an era of colonialism. You know, there's indigenous people still being murdered in places like Brazil right now, today, for the exploitation of the land that they're on. You know, it's the same situation. It's just happening right now, today. And how is it going up here in the United States? You know, like, this was just from the last election, where the news couldn't even remember how to identify us. You know, we're just something else. That was going to be our logo. We were just going to be like, come to Awami, we're something else, you know. But, you know, so growing up in this time period, like as a Native chef, especially, you know, starting this work in 2014 in the beginning, there weren't a lot of Native chefs out there. And I used to get the question all the time from news media. They'd be like, "Oh, weird, Native American food, never heard about it. Like, what is it?" Because they want to hear the cool story of like, I like get up in the morning, I go take down an elk with a slingshot I made and have a big community feast and gather a bunch of berries along the way and stuff like that. But that wasn't the reality, because I grew up in colonial America, and like I primarily grew up with the commodity food program. And there's a direct correlation to our health issues on Native communities and the commodity food program, because it's our nutritional access that's the biggest issue. Because this food, is just not good for us. It's oversaturated in salts and fats, bad fats. It's overprocessed. There's way too many carbs in this diet, and it just leads to obesity, heart disease, diabetes. We struggle with a lot of type 2 diabetes on indigenous communities, and just places where people struggle with food access in general. And when I was growing up, we didn't even have those pretty labels and cans. We just had things like beef with juices and pork with juices. It's that with juices that really sells it, right? And also when I was growing up, obviously a lot of people understood fry bread and Indian tacos, Navajo tacos, whatever you want to call them. But if you peel back the layers of history, this doesn't go back that far from us. This was something the government gave us because we didn't have wheat flour. We didn't have weird California black olives. I don't even know how they make those things. And they just, we were so diverse. This stuff tastes good, and we celebrate it, and we love it in our indigenous communities, but it should not identify all of us. This one piece shouldn't be the food that identifies us, because we are too diverse. We have so much more knowledge and valuable foods that we could share, out there. And that's why it became important to really do this work, because it's really about understanding indigenous food systems. How are people surviving for generations upon generations using the land around them healthily, with so much nutrition right off of the land? So to understand indigenous foods, you just really have to take the time to understand. It's really a story in diversity. So just first look at the ecoregions of North America. We're so diverse. We have mountains, we have plains, we have Arctic, subarctic, we have tropics, we have coastal regions, we have swamps, we have everything. And there's so much plant diversity and growing regions throughout there. And then layering indigenous peoples onto that just makes it even more diverse. One way to see that is looking at language maps. So if you look at indigenous language maps, you can start to see the immense diversity of indigenous peoples. And knowing these are very generalized, like these big color blocks, there's all sorts of subdialects and other languages sprinkled about there. There's no hard lines, So there's a lot of indigeneity alive today. And we need to be understanding of that. There's 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous. People just like to call everybody south of the border Mexican, but there's so much indigeneity, vibrance alive in Mexico today. And if you compare colonial settler states to indigenous communities, it's so much diversity. And that's a big part of this situation. And it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish or French or English, those are all foreign languages. Those are all European colonial languages, It's more important to understand the true backbone of what is truly North America. And because we're lucky that we have so many languages still alive, that we have so many indigenous communities still alive. And we're doing the best we can to protect our foods for the future generations, because as indigenous peoples, we're not colonists. We're not trying to exploit and destroy and extract, for profit. We're trying to protect and build for the future and make sure that our future generations have access to these foods, right? So when we're defining indigenous education, that's really what this is about. So we're looking at all of these pieces when it comes to indigenous education: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat production, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, indigenous histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles. There's so much out there that we need to understand, right? And so we're trying to do everything we can to make this happen, So the work that we're doing is really two-pronged. Some of it's just creating food access and showing people how to do food. The other part is creating systems to steward this knowledge for the next generations and make sure that we have this to share with everybody. This needs to be open access. So when we're looking at foods, proteins are easy.